Okay, we're live. If you have any questions or comments during the class, just type it into the comments. I will try to keep an eye on it. Okay. So, wait for everybody to come. All right, we're going to start. Okay, so this week's Parsha is Parshas Noach, which obviously the main part of Parshas Noach is the story of the flood. That's the story of Noah, right? The story of the flood. But at the end of the Parsha is as Abraham is born, right? At the end of the Parsha. But we have that in-between period, which is called the generation of the Haflaga, the generation of the Tower of Babel. So in the end, that's towards the end of the Parsha. Before, when Abraham was just a young man, it seems that's when the Abraham lived in that time. And the Torah tells us that we'll go through the story quickly. That everybody spoke the same language, which was the Hebrew language, Lashon HaKodesh, and that was the language that the world was created in, and that was the language. Everybody spoke the same language, and this is still within a few generations of Noah, so the world is relatively small. Everybody is related. Everybody is kind of together, and it says that they lived in the land of Shinar, in the land of Babylonia, and they said, the Torah says, they said to each other, "Come, let us make bricks and fire them thoroughly," and they used bricks for stone and clay for mortar. So essentially, the Rashi explains, why did they use bricks? Because there's no stones in Babylonia, because it's a valley, and it's a desert essentially, and there's no stones there, so they had to use bricks. And Rashi says that, why did it say you fire them thoroughly? That's how you make bricks. So you bake the bricks in a furnace, and that is how you make bricks. So what happened was they started building this tower, and they wanted to make this tower that would reach the heavens, and they would make a name for themselves. And God wanted to see what was going on, right? And God says, look, they're all together, right? And they want to make this tower. And actually, we see from here how important unity is. That God saw their unity. It was dangerous, because when people are united, they could accomplish a lot. But that's a side point. So God says, okay, the only way to stop them is to confuse them and to unite them. So God says, let us descend and confuse their language, so Noah understand the language of his companion. So what happened was, it says that this tower they built had steps going up the east side and steps going down the west side. So they would come up the east and they would go down the west. And they were so corrupted that what happened was they would that if somebody dropped a brick, it says they would cry and they would say, woe is to us, that when will another brick come in its stead? But if a person fell down and died, they didn't care, right? So it was really corrupted. And it says that Abraham, who was then known as Avram, the son of Terach, saw them and he cursed them and said, destroy them and divide their tongue. And before we know it, right, that that God made them all changed. They all had different languages, and all of a sudden people couldn't understand each other, and it ended in disaster, right? And that's what happened once the tower fell apart. The people were no longer united, and they started to kill each other, and the whole thing fell apart. So it's a very strange story, this generation of the Haflaga, okay? But really what the tower represented was they didn't want to do Torah mitzvahs, right? That in order to don't forget, the people of Noah was commanded 7 universal laws that still apply today to all the nations of the world. So they had mitzvahs, right? It wasn't like it was before the Torah was given. The Jewish people didn't exist, and there was no 10 commandments, but there was commandments, and they had to, right, believe in one God, don't worship idols, etc. So they didn't want to observe these mitzvahs, which is, what is a mitzvah? A mitzvah is a commandment, which also means to connect, right? And the mitzvahs are there to purify somebody, right? They're there to make us better people, to refine people. and they wanted to do what they wanted, right? Like the Torah says, they wanted to do whatever they wanted, right? They just wanted to do their own thing. They weren't interested in what God had to say. So, because the Torah mitzvahs require a person to be self-nullified, right, and to have no other, not to have your own interest, but to not subjugate yourself to God, right, and to subjugate yourself to God's will. And this is, like I said, oops, sorry, dropped the phone. Okay, hold on. So we have high tech and low tech together. Okay, so it says that when they traveled from the east, right? That's how it says. Vahi banasa mikadem. They traveled from the east. Now, the word kedem could also mean like kadmon, which means the original, the first thing. So actually, it says they removed themselves from the original being, right? They removed themselves from God, and they went to the land of Shinar, and they built a city and a tower on the other side, right? That they wanted to build a tower against holiness. So they were trying to go against God. And that's what this generation was trying to do. So this generation, again, they were trying to use this tower to build their own identity outside of godliness. So if we look back, we talked about in the beginning of the story that they used bricks, right? Specifically bricks, because the land of Babylonia apparently does not have stones. So what is all this thing about bricks? Why is it so important that they use bricks? So if we look, another time the Torah talks about bricks is in the story of the Exodus, more specifically the slavery before the Exodus, which is that the Torah says that, I'll read the verse, it says, they embittered their lives with hard work, with bricks and mortar and all kinds of work. In the fields, all of their work was with rigor, right? We say that in Haggadah every year. So the Gemara says that their main work was with bricks. That's how it started. And in the end, towards the Exodus, when Moses shows up, which is close to almost 200 years after the original beginning of the enslavement, right? It was over several generations, that Pharaoh wanted to make their lives more miserable after Moses started talking to them about the Exodus. And Pharaoh said, right, we're not going to even give you straw. We're going to make your own bricks. And then he said, we're not going to even give you straw for the bricks. You have to go out to the field and collect the straw. So we see that this bricks idea was a very big element in the slavery of the Jewish people. So what is this idea of bricks? So actually, what Pharaoh was trying to do was we know that Pharaoh wanted to crush the Jews, not just physically, which he did a great job of, but also spiritually. Right? At the beginning of the story of the Exodus, it says that there was two parts of the decree of killing the babies, right? Jewish babies. So Pharaoh said any Jewish boy is going to be thrown into the Nile, and all the Jewish girls, you have to make them live. What do you mean make them live? That's a very strange way of saying it. It said kill the Jewish boys, don't kill the Jewish girls. But it says make them live. So actually what the commentators say is that make them live means make them live like an Egyptian. In other words, we're gonna kill them spiritually as well. So physically we're gonna kill the boys, and the girls spiritually we're gonna kill them. So what Pharaoh really wanted was to kill the Jewish people. So we see from here that part of Pharaoh's job was to kill the Jews spiritually. So what he wanted to do was take their divine purpose, which is to do mitzvahs, and instead use their divine holiness to build construction cities for Pharaoh, right? That's what, instead of working on the Beis HaMikdash, instead of which the Jewish people ended up doing, right? After they leave Egypt, they end up building a house for God. Instead of building a house for God, they're building houses for Pharaoh. And he wanted to get that spiritual idea that Jewish people had, that they had using making the houses of making the house of God, instead use it for the house of Pharaoh. Because we know that in general also that when we build something, when we do a mitzvah, it's as if we're building a house for God. And if we do something not good, and avera, God forbid, then you're building the opposite of that. You're building a house for idol worship. And actually, to now get this connection, from the Exodus and slavery before the Exodus to the Tower of Bavel, the Tower of Babylonia. It says in the writings of the Arizal, who speaks a lot about reincarnation, a big topic in the writings of the Arizal. It says that the Jewish people who lived and were enslaved in the generation before the Exodus were actually a reincarnation of this generation of the Haflaga generation, this generation of dispersion, right? So, and we see this by the idea of the common denominator of the bricks. So the idea was to give them an opportunity, to give the people who built the Tower of Bavel an opportunity to rectify this by building the stuff for Pharaoh. How does that work? So the people in the generation, right, of the Dor HaFlaga, this generation of the dispersion, right, they didn't want to be nullified to God. They wanted to do whatever they wanted. So therefore, they were punished by Pharaoh to be enslaved by Pharaoh, who was also against God. Right? It says that when Moses confronts Pharaoh, right, and Pharaoh says, "Who's this God? Right, what are you talking about? Who's God? I know this God, that God. Your God is not in my dictionary." And the atlas, the annual atlas distributed by the Egyptian government, that there was an atlas of all the gods. This year's gods, what's the gods you got to pray to this season and that season? That was their yearly, what's called atlas or almanac, whatever you call it. The God Almighty, creator of the world, I don't know who he is. We see this idea that the Jewish people were enslaved by a Pharaoh who disavowed God, and that was kind of the rectification for the people who disavowed God. Okay. So now let's go back. Let's really talk about the bricks. What is the difference between bricks and stones? Again, we talked about how in the land of Bavel there was no stones, there were only bricks. They had to make bricks. So in Hasidic philosophy, it discusses the idea of bricks, of stones actually. We'll talk about stones first. What is that stones are created by God himself, right? In the 6 days of creation, stones are already made by God. So every stone that exists was created from the 6 days of creation by God himself, versus bricks are made from dirt by people, right? And you have to put them into the bricks into fire. You take the dirt and you do a whole thing to them. I'm not an expert in brick making. And you stick it in the furnace, and that's what makes bricks. And bricks can also be used to build a building, but it takes a lot more effort to make a building out of bricks than stone because of the amount of work that goes into building the actual bricks. So, in the land of Israel, we talk about there's this difference between the land of Israel and the land of Babylonia is the stones versus bricks. The land of Israel has most of the buildings that are built out of stone because the Torah tells us that one of the blessings of the land of Israel is, it says, Eretz She'avanah HaBarzel, in Deuteronomy, that it's a land whose stones are iron, meaning the stones in the land of Israel is blessed because it is the land that God is always watching over, and they're actually extra strong stones. And again, this is spiritually metaphoric to the idea that the land of Israel, again, stones represents the idea they're created directly by God. So it's kind of the idea of bringing godliness down to earth, right? That even though that God wanted that land of Israel should be a spiritual place, it still exists in this realm. And there's physical things that go on there and physical hardships and physical labor. But it has that blessing from God, right? And that's the idea of the stones that are blessed by God in the land of Israel. Versus in Babylonia, it says that it's this open valley, and it needs to, in order to have the same accomplishments outside of Israel. Babylonia is, in general, Babylonia's reference to outside of Israel, not just the actual place of Babylonia, but in general, we're still in this in the first exile of the Jewish people, right? They were exiled to Babylonia, and that's still kind of where we're at to this day, even though that there was another exile later, but we'll leave that for another time. So in order for somebody to accomplish in the land of Bavel, meaning outside of Israel, it takes a lot more effort. In Israel, you have the stones, they're ready-made, you just got to put it together. It's not so hard. Versus in the land of Babylonia, outside of Israel, you have to make the bricks. You got to take the dirt, and you got to put it into fire. And then you can make the bricks. So Babylonia represents this idea of a valley, this unguarded valley represents the idea that it looks like when you come to outside of Israel, and there's no longer that spiritual connection to God that's innate in the land of Israel, it looks like it's open. You can do whatever you want, right? There's no longer any barriers, the stone barriers that keep, right? The Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law, is no longer a barrier. It's just open season, right? That's what kind of that represents. So in order to combat that, it takes a lot of effort because you have to now fashion that yourself, right? It's no longer innate, it's no longer easy, right? But now it's difficult. So how do we do that? How do we come to outside the land of Israel? We don't have that innate, and really you could even say that nowadays it even applies in the land of Israel, because even the land of Israel is in a state of exile, is that when we're in a state of exile, it takes a lot more effort, because if you go back to the times, just to go back for a second, you go back to the times of the first temple specifically, all the Jewish people saw godliness, right? They would go to the temple, they saw 10 miracles every day, right? The land of Israel was blessed with rain. If it didn't rain, they would pray and rain would come, right? They had prophets, right? If you even in the story of how, right, of the book of Samuel, right, that Shaul HaMelech, King Saul, how did he first come to meet Shmuel? He was looking for his donkey, so he went to the prophet. Like, that was like part of life, right? You lost your wallet, you went to the prophet, where's my wallet at, right? These people had a very deep connection to God. They actually saw godliness every single day. And so it was very easy, so to speak, to do the Torah and keep the mitzvahs, because they saw it. They saw that the blessings that the Torah says, they saw clearly. They saw, again, prophecy. They saw miracles every day. But now outside of Israel, in this Babylonia of sorts, right, it takes a lot more effort. So what is that effort? So let's go back to brick making, right? How do you make bricks? Is you take natural born earth and you shape it, right, and you knead it and you bake it, and that's how you get bricks. And the same thing is with Jewish education, is that you take a person who's born into a state of like it says in the Torah that he's like a wild donkey, right? A person in his natural state would just be wild, and if you don't educate a person, they'll just become crazy, right? They're not gonna know how to take care of themselves, how to make the world a better place, how to live like a Jew, how to live like a person, how to live in society. They'll have no idea unless you educate them. So if you leave a person like dirt, the same way you leave dirt outside, nothing would happen, right? It wouldn't become a brick if you just left it. So to a person, if you don't educate them, there's not going to be any results, right? So what do? You educate a child. You tell him that if you eat candy, it's not going to be good for you, right? It's going to hurt your teeth. It's going to hurt your stomach. It's going to hurt your whatever it hurts. I'm not an expert on what it hurts. So the same thing, what you do is you take a child and you have to educate them. You have to give them a form. And then you have to give them passion, which is putting in the furnace. You have to not just teach them, okay, this is how you live in society, this is how you live as a Jew. You have to give them passion, right? That they have to be excited about Judaism. They have to be excited about being spiritual, being godly. And that's how you can educate the next generation to be good, strong Jews, right? And they can withstand, right, through the bricks, they being hardened through the passion that they're given, they will be able to withstand anything that comes against it, right? Whatever you want to use metaphor of wind and water and all the things that could come, a Jew can withstand by giving that education and passion for Judaism. So now the question is, who has it better off, right? Who has it better off? Is it the people in the times of the temple, or is it the people in the times now? And the truth is, obviously, the times now is a major disadvantage, because it's much harder, right? It takes a lot more effort. But our sages tell us that one Babylonian scholar is equal to 2 scholars in the land of Israel. Why? Because if you look at the difference between the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, you could see the Jerusalem Talmud is very straightforward. It's kind of just like, this is how it is, no questions asked. Because, again, they had that vision and spiritual connection. They didn't have as many questions, right? They understood things innately. Versus the Babylonian Talmud, everything is questioned, right? As soon as they say, okay, this is the law, the first question the Talmud, every single Talmud opens is, how do you know? How do you know, right? And you go through it, right? But that gives you that strength, that core, that questioning does. And so too, that in exile is actually a tremendous advantage to exile is that we are hardened by what's around us. And we withstand that, and that itself gives us strength. So in a way, there's actually an advantage to the exile, right? So, and actually, if you look at the temple, the temple was actually built of bricks. It was not built of stone. Even though you could build it of stone, the temple was actually built of bricks to represent this idea that it's not, even though that, yes, the bricks have a natural, innate, godly connection, right? Made by God himself, metaphorically as well, right? That is connected spiritually, but actually we wanted that idea to be also that we could actually transform the world, right? And that's actually what the temple is supposed to do. We're supposed to transform the world around us. So actually, in a way, there's an advantage to the bricks over the stones. So that's it. So this week's Parsha, when we talk about the story of the generation of the dispersion, the Dor HaFlaga, really it's not just a story that happened 4,000 years ago. It's really the story of how do we connect to God, right? How do we educate the next generation? Is through brick making, right? They used it for the opposite of good. But through the experience of the Exodus and through the experience of building the temple and through the experience of exile, we actually learned how to use that same recipe, so to speak, for good. Okay, anybody have any questions or comments? You could type comments below in our live audience. Any questions or comments?
Yeah, that's great.
Nobody has any questions. Either that means I explained it really well or really nobody understood a thing. So you could still comment. I will check the comments on the video later. Thank you everybody very much for joining, and we will see you next week for the same time, same place. Got some thumbs up, thank you. Same time, same place, Thursday, 8 p.m., live on Facebook. If you want to come in person, send a message. All the best. Have a wonderful Shabbos.